Iran recently, and had the opportunity to meet with some Jewish professional people in Iran. And he was telling me his experience and how basically these Jewish professional people are not allowed to go on buses or trains. They can only take airplanes so that they can be monitored by the government. And that this person, who was also an academic here in the United States, was unable to have a free moment with these people to try to ascertain what their situation was in Iran. So I think some of the themes and the issues that we're going to be discussing are certainly of importance to what's going on domestically in Iran and the implications regionally and internationally. So it's a great honor to have Roya here today. As many of you know, she's been in the media on a regular basis. She's helped to collaborate to make various documentary films throughout the media, some of which have appeared on ABC News and PBS. She was commissioned by UNICEF to create a film looking at the involvement of underage children in war conflict situations. She is an author and a poet. She writes op-ed pieces for papers such as the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. She's a founding member of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center, which is based here in New Haven. Her memoir, which has been widely received and acclaimed, is about a Jewish teenager growing up in post-Iran. Her book is here, by the way, and she'll be happy to sign some copies for you after if anybody's interested. The Journey from the Land of No, which is the title of the book, was Barnes & Noble's pick of the week. It was Miss Magazine's read of the summer, and all sorts of acclaims that go with it. So today, Roya is going to speak in the title.
I'll put you out of your misery. I'm good.
Okay. Today's theme is today's title is The Case of Iran Jews Today and the Limits of the Term of Assimilation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I feel like 75% of you have been to my house for dinner, or the rest of you have seen me naked at the JCC gym. So I don't know why we bother with these introductions. I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is that I'm excited about this talk. The bad news is I have never delivered it before, which means that this is entirely experimental in some ways. It's really the result of a whole bunch of other thoughts that I've had, pieces that I've written for various newspapers, and positions that I've taken, which have not necessarily been compiled into one long lecture, but I will do my best today to gather them for this purpose. So if I'm incoherent, if it doesn't add up, if I seem to stumble, forgive me, but at least the good news here is that it's all fresh and new, and I'm talking about it in many ways for the first time here. I was at ADL last night. It was ADL in New York has had a series on the issue of anti-Semitism in Iran, and I ended up on a panel with 3 or 4 people, most of whom ended up taking really incredibly upsetting and disturbing positions. And I found myself last night trying to argue, trying to basically make an argument that seemed very unusual for those who were there last night. I basically tried to create a coup at the panel. And here's what happened, and I think I want to begin with this because I think most of you, if not all of you, are thinking about Iran, the nuclear bomb, and who's going to strike Iran first. Should it be Iran? Should it be Israel? Should it be the United States? When and where and how? And wherever I go these days, no matter what I seem to be talking about, this is what comes up. So I will address it first because I think in many ways it will take the burden off of all of us. It will really put forth, it will really be addressing the elephant in the middle of the room, And you don't so much have to worry about designing your Q&A questions, because here's the question that I think all of you will ask me, and I will, and you know, let's just say there's an elephant here and address it. I think, now there's one other warning that I have to give, which is that being an Iranian, a Jewish person, and an American, I often find myself referring to myself as we. And people say, which we? Are you referring to your Jewish identity, to your Iranian identity, or to your American identity? So I will try to define it in each context, but you have to be careful, because I always assume that to me all these three are inherently embedded within each other, and if I lose you, please remind me to clarify that. But that's basically how I always refer to myself. The main point that I want to make before I embark on the subject of Jews in Iran is to say that I think we should all, and I'll say it as provocatively as I can, because I think I want us to have a very good discussion. And here's my most provocative way of putting it. I think we should all just jettison the nuclear issue and say to hell with the nuclear issue. The reason I say that is because, first of all, I probably have obsessive-compulsive disorder, and the reason I say that is that for the past 3 or 4 years, for those of you who are newsaholics, I have created Google Alert on my laptop. So every day, Google gathers up everything on the subject of Iran and delivers it to my inbox on my computer. And therefore, you can imagine, I receive hundreds of news emails about Iran. Anything with Iran in the subject headline, I get it. And for the past 4 years, I've monitored the sort of debate that has taken place around the subject of nuclear issue. And because I constantly try to produce articles and columns about Iran, I created a file under Google Alert, and I put all of these news headlines in there. And I watched to see how the news really over the past 4 years has changed, whether or not there's been a progress in the debate on the subject of Iran. And there hasn't been. If any of you is interested, I'm happy to forward you the file. For the past 4 years, there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of headlines on the subject of where Iran is going with its nuclear bomb, and there's been absolutely no developments. There are signs of hope. They all get together and have a negotiation or a discussion somewhere. Then it all falls apart. Then the U.S. begins to make some threats. Then the Iranians kind of say something in return, and then the Europeans say, oh, don't worry, we're all going to fix it. So there are some new round of negotiations. It all looks good for a while. Then it falls apart again, and so on and so forth. So after about 3 or 4 years of really watching this very, very closely, I decided that it ain't going anywhere. That basically, and it reminded me of something that I'm sure for many of you who were around at this time, it reminded me of the story of the hostage crisis in Iran in 1979. I think that the regime in Iran has developed a knack for creating a huge stir in news media. In 79, it was the hostage crisis. Later on, it was the fatwa against Salman Rushdie. These days, it's the nuclear issue. The regime precisely wants the entire international community focused on exactly where they want them focused on. And that's because it enables them to internally go about doing whatever it is that they want to do. I know this particularly well because having worked as a producer in television, I was amazed at the amount of coverage that, for instance, the hostage crisis had received in the United States. But I worked at ABC. I've gone through the entire archive that exists at Nightline, and basically what received very little attention around here is the fact that by getting the focus of the international community on the gates of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, they were able to, basically the regime was able to quash the democratic movement in Iran. What you didn't realize is that as a result of takeover of the American embassy, the provisional government that was in power in Iran in 1979, which was composed of a group of really well-educated, moderate Iranians who had gone back to build a post-revolutionary Iran that was very much followed the model that we would all in this room be happy about, were forced to resign because of their protests, because of the stance that they took against the takeover of the American embassy. This is the sort of news that you missed. We in fact, as Iranians, lost a great opportunity after the takeover of the American embassy, and the opportunity that we lost was that by the taking of the 52 hostages, the focus was entirely on the 52 hostages. The regime went about its business, forced out the moderate liberal elements from the post-revolutionary Iran. It completely annihilated the opposition, and but the international community could hardly care because we were all focused on the 52 hostages. I think a similar scenario is unfolding in Iran right now. The world is focused on the nuclear issue, and it's only focused on the nuclear issue. There is nothing that the regime would benefit more from than having the entire world community focused on this one issue, which I assure you for the past 3 or 4 years has basically gone nowhere. And which is not to say that they're not serious about building a bomb, and it's not to say that Ahmadinejad and the elite of this regime isn't serious about the claims that it's making, but it's to say that one way or another, we as enlightened audiences need to stretch the field in order not to allow this sort of obsessive coverage of issues, in order to make sure that the field is not entirely a nuclear field, and there are other issues that enter this debate. So the second reason that I object to discussions about the nuclear issue is that no one has an answer. There were people on the panel last night who were from the most right-wing neoconservative institutes like American Enterprise, and there were people from the Council on Foreign Relations. You name it, people were there. And no matter what they say, the truth, the underlying truth is no one really has a straightforward answer. No one knows how to address the situation. So if we all, some people propose military strike, but at the same time, every military general or commander that you respect would tell you that the way the nuclear plants have been built in Iran is in such a way that you just simply can't take them out by airstrikes. That they built them in a variety of places. They go way down, and it would be extremely difficult to simply, uproot them by airstrikes. So the people who are in favor of a military operation are remiss on the fact that military operation against Iran, based on the greatest advice, has been called not entirely productive and helpful. People who we have seen over the past 3-4 years that negotiations with Iran isn't going anywhere. So my proposal is that if we are not getting anywhere by pushing this on, by pushing the nuclear issue, maybe we should just try to upend this debate and try to look at it from an entirely different perspective. The perspective that I'm hoping to introduce today, and the perspective that I think we should all be advocating for, is a human rights perspective. I think we have tried in every possible way to encourage Iran to get this discussion to go in a different direction. All sorts of negotiations with Iran have been attempted. When Clinton was in the administration, we swapped soccer players and librarians, and we sent them cakes and gifts, and they sent stuff back to us. We lifted sanctions on pistachios and rugs, and it basically didn't go anywhere. Madeleine Albright even delivered an apology for the coup of 1953. It didn't really do very much, even during the Clinton administration. So my proposal is that we take the nuclear debate out of this realm and begin to really look at the situation in Iran from a human rights perspective, and say to ourselves, even if Iranians signed a contract today and promised us that they would not be developing nuclear weapons, will the rest of us sleep tightly at peace in our homes, thinking, oh, they're not a threat to the international community anymore? And my answer is obviously no, because we know Iran is playing a major role in the unrest in Iraq. We know Iran is playing a major role in creating unrest in southern Lebanon. Iran is the major supporter, if not the inventor of the concept of Hezbollah, and continues to do so. So I say, why are we focused on this one particular issue when we have so many other reasons to expand this debate, to look at Iran and say, regardless of what happens to the bomb, we have so many other reasons to believe, by the way that they are violating the rights of Iranians, by the way that they're treating their own minorities, by the way that they're treating women in Iran, that they're not going to be honorable members of the international community. And regardless of what contract and what covenant they sign, we're not going to look at them as equal partners in our debate. So this is what I wanted to put forth and say that ultimately I think the way to go about this, and this is basically what our ADL discussion last night came to, is to say that we have to somehow all come to a consensus on the fact that Iran, regardless, will not be an honorable member of the international community, regardless of how they agree to manage the nuclear issue. Now, where do we go from there is tricky, because I think a lot of the negotiations that need to take place with other EU members, not with Iran. I think a lot of the conversations that we need to be having are the conversations that we need to have with our partners around the world about Iran. But somehow we think that diplomatic negotiations and diplomacy needs to be conducted with Iran itself. My proposal is that if we agree that we are through with, we have done all we can in pushing the argument forward with Iran, we should then go forward and try to see whether or not we can bring the entire Europe to our side, whether or not we can create a consensus among our allies as to how to approach Iran. Now, how does this all relate to the issue of anti-Semitism and Jews in Iran? Well, I have to tell you a story first, which is I was speaking at the Museum of Holocaust in New York about almost a year ago, and it was a conversation that was completely focused on the book. I read passages, and there was an interviewer, and he interviewed me on stage, and then there were Q&As, and one of the audience members raised his hand and said, I've read your book. In your entire book, there is no mention of Purim or Queen Esther. And what have you got to say about that? And I didn't really know what to say. I tried, you tried your hardest, your darnest best to be polite and considerate. So the best answer I could come up with was that, she came a little bit before my time. So after this conversation, when the audience members were coming over to chat with me and get their books signed, one of them came over to me and said, "You're my hero. I have to get together with you. We have to talk. You have no idea what you did tonight. What you said to this man is one of the most important things that I've ever heard." And I really didn't think very much of my own comment, but in any event, he bothered to take a 2-hour drive from Brooklyn, New York, to come to New Haven to tell me that the fact that I had told this gentleman that Queen Esther was before my time, and in fact I had tried to really say that it's possible to be an Iranian Jew but tell a different story that doesn't include the stereotypes that you expect to always be told is something that excited him. And he said, well, he was an Iraqi Jew, or actually son of Iraqi Jews, and he said, I believe there's a grand conspiracy by Ashkenazi Jews to co-opt and colonize the narrative of Sephardic Jews. I don't know. I tried to, since he had driven 3 hours to come up, and it seemed to be such a pressing matter, I tried to really think about it, whether or not the Ashkenazi Jews were conducting a major conspiracy against the Sephardic to colonize their narrative or not. But I come from a country where conspiracy theories are abound, and I'm basically extremely immune to them. But after I listened to him, I realized that there are these rumors, and there is this apprehension that one way or another, Jews who come out of experiences post-Germany and in the last 20, 30 years are expected to be telling the same story or a familiar story. And instead of thinking that the narrative is being hijacked or colonized, I thought, is it possible that we have gotten used to wanting to tell ourselves and each other the same story over and over again? And the same story being, we were in some place, things got really bad, they threw us out and we left. And do we want it? Do we want that story to be to be just that, or are we open to the notion of examining the complexities of that broad headline, which is we were there, things got bad, we were forced to leave and we left. Are we ready to really examine what the many layers and the unexpected other stories that go into that broader headline? So I don't look at it as by any shape or form as there being a dominant Ashkenazi narrative trying to colonize the Sephardic narrative, but I want to say that I think it's important for us, especially when it comes to Iran, to focus on the unexpected stories and the unique events that drove Jews out of Iran in 1979 and continue to drive the Jews out of Iran until today. The reason I think that's important is because by looking at that, we will see that the circumstances that are driving Jews out of Iran are very much the circumstances that are driving secular Iranians out of Iran as well. That in many ways, what has become a thorn in the side of the Jewish community in Iran is the very thorn that is in the side of the secular average Iranians who don't see eye to eye with the regime as well. Which is not to say that there is no broader anti-Semitism in Iran, and again, it is not to say that the situation of Jews in Iran is a dire one, but it is to say that we are an extension of a broader problem from which the rest of the average Iranian secular or non-fundamentalist community is also suffering. Let me surprise you by a few facts that you probably don't know, and then using those facts I can kind of begin to stretch this conversation. Here's a good anecdote. In 1981, music was banned in Iran. That meant that the Madonnas, the great rock stars and folk musicians of Iran could no longer play. They would not be aired on radio, they would not be aired on television, and they had no music halls or symphony spaces open to them. In 1981, I was 15, 16 years old, and I was an avid fan of Iranian folk music. There was also an organization called the Iranian Jewish Student Organization. We used to go there on Thursday evenings. We had heady debates, and on Friday mornings, Fridays are Iran's day off, we would get together at 5 o'clock in the morning and go mountain climbing. Thursday evenings, we generally invited a speaker, and the speakers were good. They delivered a talk, we asked questions, then we all had dinner together and went home. On one Thursday evening, at the Iranian Jewish Student Organization, my dream of all time came true. I sat at dinner next to the Iranian equivalent of, I don't know, Michael Jackson? No, much better than Michael Jackson, at least morally. But someone who I had absolutely adored and admired for many, many years, whose music I loved and listened to for many, many years. And he was sitting next to me, like you and you are sitting next together, and we actually, passed the bread to each other and had dinner together. And then after dinner, he performed for us. The reason he did that was because when music was banned in Iran, given that Jews were considered the people of the book, were considered a legitimate religious minority, and given that music was not banned in Jewish religion, these musicians who had no other audiences, who had no other possibility of performing anywhere else, came and played for us and for foreign embassies in Tehran. And that's the only two access to the audiences that they had. I hope I surprised you. I certainly said that in order to surprise you, to say that the conditions of Jews in Iran, even after this regime, is a very complex one. To say that they are anti-Semitic would be to try to just simplify the story in such a way that you and I can quickly say hello and leave. But it really doesn't shed light on the multi-layered, really difficult landscape of how Jews live in Iran today, nor does it really shed light on how we, the rest of us, as American Jews, should be thinking about what's going on in Iran with respect to Israel and the Jewish community. So what this requires is what we, as users and viewers of MSNBC and Fox and NBC and these fast news networks are used to, which is to try to get us to not want a quick and a simple black and white answer. Now let me surprise you once again. If you have a party in Iran and the members of the Pastaran or the Revolutionary Guards break into your party and catch you drinking beer, and you are a Muslim person, you would be hauled off and probably receive several lashings and could even suffer jail time. If you are a member of a Jewish community, they break into your home, you're having a party and you're drinking alcohol, you're good. It's not a problem. Why? Because Jews are people of the book. In their religion, in our religion, it's okay to drink, so we can have wine and we can have drinks in our homes. Does this mean that we have cushy lives and a wonderful condition? No, not by any stretch of imagination. It is just to say that when we say that the condition of Jews in Iran is a bad one, we can't just make a blanket statement. We have to say, which aspect of Jewish life in Iran are you referring to? Are you referring to the progress of Jews in the academia? If that's the case, yes, the conditions are very bad for all the people, especially Jews and members of minorities who cannot go through the moral and ethical and religious component of the entrance exam that everyone is required to take in order to enter university. The Iranian government, since the 1979 revolution, has, in my belief, has been very equivocal as to what it really wants to do with the Jewish community in Iran. The reason is, in the first few years of the revolution, Jews were banned from leaving Iran. But if you actually confronted a passport official, a customs person, and said, have you confiscated my passport, or are you going to return it to me? They would not say, we have confiscated your passport and you're going to live, you're banned from leaving Iran. They would say, come back in 3 months. You go back in 3 months and you would say, can I have my passport now? Or are Jews banned from leaving? Oh, no. Jews aren't banned from leaving, but would you please come back in 4 months? So the point that I'm trying to make is that I think the regime, up until this point, has really not made a decision what it wants to do with this particular Jewish community. Does it mean that, and the reason that happened was back in '79, Ayatollah Khomeini was met by a group of Iranian Jewish leaders who made a special trip to his home in Qom and sat down to hear it from his own mouth whether or not he thought that because of his hostility against Israel, the condition of Jews in Iran was going to be a dangerous one. Whether or not, in '79 he had decided that just like he wanted to do away with Israel, he also wanted to do away with the Jewish community. The community leaders made a trip to his home, and maybe I should read you a couple of pages. How much time do we have? I can read you a short passage about that meeting. 6 people get together. This is after a highly regarded, a leading Iranian Jewish person had gotten executed, along with the first round of affluent Iranians who were being rounded up and executed in the first days of post-revolutionary Iran. Habib el-Ghamiyan was his name, and he was a huge philanthropist, and actually the man who brought plastic to Iran. So his execution was in many ways hugely symbolic, that the entire country to some degree felt indebted to him as a person who was not only a successful businessman, but an entrepreneur and someone who had introduced an element into Iranian life that had not been there before. After the execution of Elghanian, the entire community was thrown into disarray and thought that maybe this is the plan for the rest of the community as well. So the mission went to Ayatollah Khomeini in Qom and really confronted him and said, what's the story? What do you want to do with us? And Khomeini kept the 6 people who had gone there for about 3 hours, and he delivered a long, convoluted speech about copulation. It had nothing to do with Jews, Iran, or anything. It had to do with the laws of matrimony and when and why it's good for men and women to get together at certain times of the month. So the group is entirely befuddled and very, very confused, and they're really worried that this is his way of saying, just go away, I'm not interested in addressing your concern. But at the very end of that bizarre speech, he makes a segue and he says, in the Holy Quran, Moses, salutations upon him and all of his kin, has been mentioned more than any other prophet. Prophet Moses was a mere shepherd when he stood up to the might of Pharaoh and destroyed him. Moses, the speaker to Allah, represented Pharaoh's slaves, the Mustazafin of his time. Now, Mustazafin was really the equivalent of the world proletariat that Ayatollah Khomeini had borrowed from the Marxist vocabulary and introduced and created the Arabic equivalent of it and constantly used it. So whenever Ayatollah Khomeini referred to anybody as a member of the Mustazafin, it meant that that person was a celebrated person or was with the okay crowd as far as he was concerned. So the moment he invokes Mustazafin, the 6 Jews who had gone there knew that this couldn't be so terrible. And then he continues to say, Moses would have nothing to do with these Pharaoh-like Zionists who run Israel, and our Jews, the descendants of that Moses, have nothing to do with them either. We recognize our Jews as separate from those godless, blood-sucking Zionists. Well, it sounds very harsh to you and me, here in New Haven in the United States, but at that time it was a huge relief to the community who had gone to receive some word of assurance that the plan was not to do away with the entire Jewish community. The mission brought back that one line and then painted it, that one last line that we recognize the difference between our Jews and those godless Zionists. They painted it on the wall of every Jewish school, every synagogue throughout Iran, especially in Tehran. So we used to march to our class in school looking at these slogans every morning and kind of bowing to them. So that distinction that Khomeini made early on during the revolution really was an issue of policy. And what it meant was that Jews were going to be unharmed, but that didn't mean that various opportunities were not going to be denied them. But what I'm trying to encourage us to think about is that you're talking about a country and a situation that in which Jews have being a Jewish person at times can actually be to your advantage than being a secular Muslim person who seems to be in disagreement or has a political endorses a political opinion other than that of the regime. That in one instance, when this group of the Iranian Jewish students and I went on some of you who have read my book may remember this scene that we went mountain climbing on a day that was actually a day of mourning in Iran all of us considered ourselves, radical liberals, and somewhere in the mountain, a group of Revolutionary Guard members who had tried to close the mountain. Now, I don't know how exactly you can shut down the mountain. It's sort of like, telling Niagara Falls not to fall, exactly. Or something of that sort, but they did try to actually shut down the mountain on that day, and of course, the mountain being so vast, we just, found a way up, and somewhere half our hike, they stopped us and said, you are violating the close the mountain rule today, and we're going to round you up and take you away. They took us away, and we were to the headquarters, and we were there, and they had found some books and literature on us that were unsavory by their standards, and those books and literature could have caused, could have been the very reasons for those of us on whom they had found this, for detention, arrest, at least several days of questioning and interrogation. But what happened was, somewhere along this conversation that they were having with one of us, and I among them, they discovered that we were Jewish. I had something. My mother had put a piece of a traveler's prayer in my knapsack for safekeeping. Because she was always afraid that I would go mountain climbing and fall or something. So she had slipped this prayer in Hebrew into my bag, and the guy who was going through my knapsack found it and said, "What is this?" And I said, "It's Hebrew." And he said, "Are you Jewish?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Oh, the rest of you are Jewish?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Oh, Jews don't care about politics. Go home." It was absolutely, obviously untrue. We all were incredibly politically active, or so we thought of ourselves. And the kinds of material that they found on us could have been grounds for serious arrest, had we not been Jewish. But sometimes reverse stereotyping and reverse discrimination also works. And in that case, we were all released. Whereas a lot of my Muslim counterparts who had been found with similar books and audio cassettes and stuff were taken away, and some I never heard from. Now, I want to end this this talk today by saying that I think Iran gives a very, very rich and historically important and perhaps unique, at least in modern times, for Jews to make a very different kind of argument, for us as Jews to make a very different kind of argument that we have never made before, or at least not in modern times. And Charles, who watches these talks on a regular basis, can tell me to go to hell because I just don't know what I'm talking about, and I would be happy to hear that. But I think the opportunity that Iran provides us as Jews who are enlightened, who want to see a peaceful solution to this very serious problem, to see our own situation and dilemma precisely as what it is, as not uniquely targeted at us as a Jewish minority, but really an extension of a wider and more serious problem from which the entire Iranian society that doesn't endorse the regime is suffering from. Now, this does not take away from the seriousness of the threat that they pose to Israel or the threat that they pose to the Jewish community. But what it does is that it really reveals this very complex situation for what it is. As a situation that after 30 years, the Iranian people at large are the people that I'm sure those of you who are following the news of Iran have seen. The Iranians are the only ones in all of the Middle East who are extremely pro-American, I don't know any journalist who hasn't gone to Iran and not returned saying, I'm amazed at the great reception that we received. And Iranians are the only nation in the entire region who, unlike all the rest of their neighbors, are beginning to be curious about Israel. I'm not saying are beginning to be pro-Israel, but I'm saying they're beginning to be curious about Israel. That's not because, they suddenly have changed, the textbooks and are having positive propaganda machine. It's just that after 30 years of having recycled and manufactured various propaganda and not really delivering on the promises of the revolution, the public is extremely suspect of the regime's propaganda. If the regime today makes a declaration that it's night, the public will probably think that it must be day. If the regime points to the sun and says, look, it is day, the public would probably consider that it's nighttime. This is entirely the result of 30 years of a revolution that has come to a dead end and has been unable to make its good on its promises. And as a result of it, the Iranian nation has turned into a nation that is highly suspect of its regime propaganda. For those of you who followed, let me just remind you, because I'm sure you've seen it, and I think it's relevant to our conversation, so I want to remind you, if you saw the coverage of the Hezbollah war in Lebanon over the last 3-4 months, the New York Times had a lead piece by their stringer in Tehran. And I forget the exact wording of the headline, but the reporter was saying that Iranians are the only people in the entire region who are not supporting the Hezbollah and believe that they don't wish for their government to be funneling money outside of their own borders and giving it to these other people elsewhere, because they had more needs and they were suffering economically. Why support the Palestinians when your own people need it most? That, coupled by, for those of you who read New York Review books and are fans of Timothy Garton Ash, he came back from Iran last year and said that Iranians have developed healthy curiosity towards Israel. For those of you who blog and are interested in the blogosphere, the father of Iranian blogs, the man who started the first Iranian blog, was a journalist who decided last year, to hell with regime's propaganda, he was going to go to Israel on his own and see what's going on there. He did. He spent about 2 months in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. There was not a day that an op-ed didn't print in Jerusalem Post and other major Israeli dailies, talking about this guy's trip to Israel and what a wonderful time he was having. He, of course, can't return to Iran, so he's sort of blogging from Canada, but nowadays. But what I'm trying to leave you with is that I think there is a wonderful opportunity here for us to, yes, look at Iran and the regime in Tehran with all the seriousness that it deserves, because it's a menace and it has to go. But also, look past the regime and really see the grander, more historically durable change that has taken place, which is really the introduction of a movement of enlightenment from Iran. If you do away with Ahmadinejad, if you do away with the president, then beneath it you have a people who 30 years ago wanted to test the dream of having an Islamic theocracy. The rest of the region is consumed with that dream now. The Pakistanis want to know what it's like. The Iraqis want to give it a try. the Afghans keep wanting to give it another try. Iranians are through. They tried it for 30 years. It was no good. They want to do away with it. They, 10, 15 years ago, one of the leading philosophers of Islamic reform came out of Iran and said, we've got to reform our religion. I think we have a fantastic opportunity, also as Jews, to look at the situation of Jews in Iran, history of Jews in Iran, and the dire circumstances of the Jewish community in Iran as an extension of the bigger problem that Iran is suffering from, and therefore find a universal cause in something that we are accustomed to just attributing to us and us alone. I'm happy to take questions.
Start with the questions. So thank you very much. So in a sense, my question is about context. Because I remember I was doing research on youth unemployment in Quebec, and particularly focusing on minorities and light of the nationalist movement in Quebec. And I wrote it in Quebec at the time, it was about 12 years ago, youth unemployment in the African Canadian community, or the black community, was 60%. And I gave a paper at a nationalist university, the University of Montreal, at a very nationalist department that dealt with ethnicity and society. And I gave my paper, and they accused me coming from an Anglo perspective with more emphasis on identity rather than the collective identity of Quebec society. And the people use deconstruction to say, well, the black youth of Montreal and Quebec are English and French. They're male and female. There's Haitians, there's West Africans, there's North Africans. So they sort of deconstructed away the community, and at the end of the deconstruction said that my paper was incorrect because the problem didn't exist because the community didn't exist.
Are you just being polite?
No, so
you want to say that?
No, so my question is, how do you focus on the context? Because on the one hand, I think most people realize that Iran is a rich civilization and culture, and it's a dynamic society, and there is a reform movement around. But how much time is there? Because in a sense, I believe Ahmadinejad and the regime and the Ayatollahs, the supreme leaders, have made statements repeatedly about the nuclear bomb and trying to wipe Israel from the face of the earth, etc., and it's a real threat. So how much time is there? Is the reform movement strong? And
no, I mean it's a greatly valid question. Now, how much time is there? I don't know, but people who are supposed to know don't know either. I mean, last year, the MI6 and the Mossad printed a story, came out with a report that ran in the Washington Post, and then everybody else picked it up, which was, Iran is 10 years away from the bomb. I don't know. I mean, this is as recently as last year. They were supposed to be 10 years away. Are they closer now? Well, maybe 5, 6 years away. The point is that I think with what's going on in Iraq and in that entire region, it's very obvious, I think, and we all know that without even having it's unnecessary discussion that just nobody can afford to go into Iran. And in addition to that, Iran, even airstrikes or military occupation of Iran in any shape or form, not military occupation, but airstrikes against Iran doesn't really guarantee the wiping out of the nuclear facilities in a very effective way. So what that really leaves as a possibility is to try to enable, in whatever shape or form that we can, not the reform movement, because I think the reform movement, as the press covered it, 10 years ago, is dead, but try to find a way of enabling a nation, or empowering, rather, a nation that has, in every possible way, showed its dissatisfaction with the regime. There was the second largest labor strike took place in Iran about a year ago. 1,000 bus drivers. There was a huge strike by by bus drivers throughout Iran, something of the magnitude of the Montgomery, Alabama bus strike that became such an important part of American history took place in Iran. And, all bus drivers quit work, decided not to drive. They wanted a raise, and the rest of the international community was consumed by the story of the Muhammad cartoons. So as 1,000 Iranian bus drivers got rounded up, arrested, and taken to prison, almost no one reported on it. And what really should have happened was for all labor unions throughout the world to deliver messages of solidarity or do acts of solidarity, all these things that in the past, in the example of the Soviet Union, the Soviet blocs, the Eastern European blocs, throughout history have kind of gotten one revolution, a revolution that has started within, or has been on the verge of starting in one country, to really catch on and become an international fever, failed to happen with this particular case. You've had Iranian women taking to streets for a variety of reasons. I mean, as most recently it was the issue that women were banned from attending soccer matches in stadiums. And they took to streets and they staged a huge march demanding only this, that we want to go to soccer stadiums. It wasn't about, equal rights under the law. It wasn't about, wanting to run for judges or any such, grand, legitimate other demands. It was just about wanting to go to soccer stadiums. And they took to streets, and it was a mass demonstration by Iranian women. Well, it wasn't covered, because everything that gets coverage these days is all about the nuclear bomb. So what I am, in essence, saying is that not only we are not moving forward with the nuclear issue, but as a result of it, we have eclipsed a lot of other, really fantastically important issues that can, in a way, be a way out, show us an exit out of this, predicament that we've fallen into. But unfortunately, I think the regime wants us focused on the nuclear debate, and they take huge advantage from that particular focus. It enables them to really conduct themselves with impunity on the domestic scene, in the absence of any attention from any press outside.
Just let me interrupt for a second. If anyone has a Jeep SUV license plate 785NAM, you're blocking everybody. Trying to get out at this parking lot up above. No one has that?
Roya, I have to give you a little bit of background.
Yeah.
I was a dean in Iran when you were a teenager between 1975 and 79.
I was good.
I want to tell you about the solidarity between this Ashkenazi Litvak and the Sephardic Jews of Tehran.
Please.
Every Shabbat, every holiday when I was there, I was invited to the Mashhadi Sephardic synagogue. You probably know where it is. And they always insisted they place me in the seat right next to the president of the synagogue. Even though I could not read Rashi Hebrew, I felt that I was in good company. But let me now get to the issue which I didn't hear you address today. I received this email with this quote from Rabbi Marvin Heer, the Dean of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles. Iran is moving closer and closer to the ideology of the Nazis. And here it is. Human rights groups are raising alarms over a new law, which was passed 2 years ago, by the Iranian parliament that would require the country's Jews to wear a yellow badge, the Christians to wear a red badge, and the Zoroastrians to wear a blue badge.
No.
Let me
let me stop you just for 1 second, because this is a story that originally appeared in a Toronto National Post.
It was in Canada, right.
In Canada.
Right.
It was a hoax, and the author had to apologize for it and try to justify himself why he had deduced from certain debates that were going on in the Iranian Majlis that this could happen. But anyway, it didn't become law, and it isn't law.
It isn't law,
It is
but
not.
it's impending. Let me give you an example. I was there when I counseled many Jewish families to leave Iran. Why? I told them the story of the German Jews and the Austrian Jews who felt very complacent that nothing would ever happen to them because they were citizens of Germany and Austria. A number of families, you might know some of the families, the Brokim family, very distinguished family, the Nemetzadas, finally were persuaded to leave Iran. Now, there were 85,000 Iranians when I was there. There are now 25,000 remaining. Why are they there? They are the poor Jews who could not leave the country. Why isn't there an effort, just as Israel moved the Ethiopian Jews to Israel, to get these 25,000 Jews out of the country? They are in mortal danger. And that's my comment.
I don't disagree. I think the Jewish community can given the sentiments of the president and his rhetoric, become some sort of political pawn. I agree. But are you saying? But to say, and let me challenge you here,
Sure.
because this is what we have to do. It's Yale University. By saying that, I think it doesn't help us, and it's inaccurate to, and it doesn't provide any insight to say Ahmadinejad is another Hitler. He isn't another Hitler. He wants to sound like a Hitler. He's hoping to be taken as seriously as Hitler. And he is dangerous, but he's not Hitler. Because the one thing that doesn't make him Hitler is the fact that he is coming 30 years after the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini. Maybe had he come 30 years ago in 1980, when the public really wanted, to embrace a new idea, a new lifestyle, new ways of, dealing with the world, he would have had a different chance. But he's coming 30 years late. He's coming at a time when the entire public, the 70% of whom is under the age of 30, is sick and tired of politics, period. In fact, when they see me, they say, go away, I don't want to see you because you're the generation who took to the streets and overthrew the Shah, who wasn't so bad after all. And what do they want? They don't have grand political, social ambitions. They want discos, They want to hold their girlfriends' hands and walk on the streets. Much to my own dismay, they're not a really politically sophisticated, don't have really grand, visions about the Iranian society or the future. They just want little things. They want to have enough money to be able to move out of their parental homes and make a house for themselves. And they can't give a hoot about the Palestinians because they believe that their government is selling them out in the interest of a cause in which they don't feel themselves invested whatsoever. And I think, yes, the Jews of Iran are in mortal danger because there's a crazy man at the helm who may use them as a political pawn. And yes, I think they're probably extremely poor, old, and for one reason or another, don't think that they can leave or have the means to leave. But at the same time, we have to remember that the Jewish problem is an extension of a larger problem from which the entire Iranian community is suffering. We have, as Jews, aren't being singled out as just one group of people and squeezed out and discriminated against. This is a disease that, especially after 30 years, the majority of average secular Iranian Muslims are extremely disenchanted with. And I think it's very important to remember that.
Hey, you've told us about the poor reporting from Iran. How much news is getting into Iran?
Depends what you have access to. There's. I hear that Tehran is a hub, is an internet, wireless hub. So, if you have a wireless laptop and your laptop is capable, you can open it up anywhere in Tehran and just log on and cruise the net. So it depends on what you have access to. If you have access to the internet, there's a lot of news. Now, another thing, everybody keeps kind of banging Iranians on the head with this, saying, you don't have a serious opposition. Where is your political opposition? If the regime is so bad, where are your organizations to overthrow them and your, leaders and oppositions? Whereas, I assure you, none of us, nobody, pre-perestroika could have, even known that there was a Gorbachev in the horizon. I think, after a while, when he came out, he caught everybody pretty much by surprise, and then we all decided that, he was a great man. But Iran is on that, in a very similar situation, in the sense that, never in history of Iran, and I want to know if other people can point to another instance, have there been 22 exile television stations that are beaming into Iran from abroad, with content that is totally anti-regime, or at least, the majority of the content being totally anti-regime. I mean, there are people broadcasting, Iranian exiles broadcasting from Great Britain, from Los Angeles, there's, one of the most popular radio programs in Iran, listened to by millions, is the Persian voice of Israel that gets beamed into Iran, 2 times a day. There are Iranians who call, there's a call-in show on the Israeli Persian Voice of Israel program that it's flooded with calls all the time by Iranians who listen to it all the time. And oftentimes the interviewer has to answer calls which come in from average Iranians throughout Iran saying, when will you come and bomb our leaders? Well, really, that's not our plan. So would you please tell them to come and bomb our leaders? I mean, it's absurd, but it's true. So there is a wide variety of, your just regular, Deutsche Welle, VOA Persian section, BBC Persian section, and then in addition to that, some couple of dozen exile broadcasts that beam into Iran on a regular basis. So if you have a dish in Iran, you can watch anything. And the regime tried to basically, fine people for the dishes for many, many years. So people had to take them off their rooftops and plant them among their bushes in the courtyard, or find a good way of hiding the satellite dishes so that they won't be seen, so they wouldn't be fined. But it's been another one of those ongoing battles with the public.
How do you respond to the contention that your argument can be turned on its head? That is, that as the reform movement grows and the regime feels more and more vulnerable, it will be tempted to, one, engage in nuclear or other foreign adventurism to unite the nation, and or to engage in anti-Semitism, which is always in fashion, so as to find a scapegoat. So, I mean, reform itself can give rise to the very things that you think reform can ameliorate.
But that you can make that argument about reform
Just about
anywhere,
anything. Fair enough.
So you would say, I can't step out of my apartment because I can get hit by a bus. Yes,
Okay.
that's always a chance that societies run because they want to do something great. That's sort of the existential comment you can make on about anything when we want change. I think the important thing is actually not even Iran within the next 10 years. Look, Iran has provided a movement that because we are living through it, we are unaware of its significance. Islam is the newest of the 3 monotheistic religions, and it hasn't undergone the sort of reforms that, Judaism and Christianity have experienced, by virtue of, in part, being having more years on Islam. And what has begun in Iran is an enlightenment in that will affect the history of Islam as we know it for the next several hundred years. The most interesting, intriguing debates in Islamic philosophy have begun in Iran and are going on in the Islamic world because of the movement that began in Iran. I mean, Iran didn't just, because Iran exported a fanatic like Ayatollah Khomeini, it is that Iranian Islamic intellectuals have taken it upon themselves to become introspective and to really look at, why they have been the hotbed of zealots such as him. So I think in the long run, it's very important, to look at this, layer of, we have Khomeini, we have Ahmadinejad, and we have all these characters. But also, the unreported story at the bottom is that some of the most intriguing debates that are going on in the Islamic world have originated from Iran regarding the reform of Islam as a religion. I'm sorry you look unhappy.
I'm unhappy because you're so relentlessly optimistic.
Wonderful.
I'm not going to apologize for being optimistic.
I have a question. My father-in-law, may rest in peace, spent a good 30 years in Iran, first as a Romanian Jew fleeing from the Nazi regime. And then he eventually made Aliyah into Israel in the early 60s. And at that, I think up to the overthrow by Khomeini, Israel and Iran actually were on very good terms because within a few years, because he spoke perfect Persian, of course, and he had been involved in big, he was a civil engineer and he was known for building dams and stuff like this. He was sent back from Israel in this contract with Iran for another 5 or 6 years. And I'm wondering whether that relationship, which actually went on for quite a while, there were still remnants of that within the population.
Precisely. I mean, look, here's something that will cheer you up because it's the most pessimistic thing I can come up with. When I was in my last year, when I was in high school, in 1982 through 1984, the washrooms in my high school, which by then I had transferred out of a Jewish school and I was in a regular school, which was predominantly Muslim, were separated. So you had stalls for Muslims and you had stalls for non-Muslims. So usually when I say this, everybody goes ooh and ah. And you seem to be so quiet. But anyway, it was quite a shock and of course a profound disappointment to me because these were stories that even my parents hadn't heard of since they were very, very young. So it looked as if we had gone through 2 or 3 generations and gone back to where we had started from. But the truth is, they did separate the bathrooms, but none of my classmates followed the rule. I went to the Muslim-only bathrooms and took a piss every day. They crossed the way and went to our bathrooms all the time. We washed our hands in each other's sinks. And after a while, the school authorities realized that we just ain't gonna do it. What I think is significant in the case of Iran is that the regime has been far more radical than the population that is ruling. And I think this is the problem of the Iranian regime with respect to the Jews, that they really do want to jumpstart and get the population on, doing a whole bunch of really bad things to the religious minorities. But so far, the public, by and large, hasn't done the kind of systematic acts that it would take to really create a crisis. Now, there have been acts of vandalism. There have been
Cartoons exhibitions,
sorry?
Holocaust cartoon exhibitions.
Exactly, but how many people do you think went to see it? They post these, because you're talking about, Tehran as a sophisticated capital with a lot of really great art galleries. And, sophisticated art scene goers ain't gonna go to the Holocaust cartoon exhibits, which is precisely the sort of reporting that came out of the New York Times stringer who was covering the story. Said, yes, there is a Holocaust cartoon exhibit here, but nobody's coming to see it. Which was right, Jim? That's what you read. So I think it's very important for us, because to show that there is a pessimistic situation is what you get every day in the paper. What I'm trying to do is to say that this very pessimistic situation has highly complex and sophisticated aspects that if you really truly open it up and look at it, you'll see that there's news in there, there's surprise in there, and we owe it to ourselves to be just reporters and just witnesses.
Let me accept the notion that 70% of the population wants discourse and a good life and business. Yet when we look at the history, we had a reform movement which petered out. Party didn't do very well, they weren't very effective. But it also, when it came to the next election, it was rigged. The election was rigged, so the people...
This election?
The last election.
It wasn't rigged.
Well, I thought the people who were allowed to run were not exactly, wasn't open to anyone.
But that has been the story of elections in Iran since the
all
beginning.
right. So it was another rigged election,
Yeah.
right. And the people who were running it were the mullahs, the ayatollahs.
Thank
So my question to you really is, knowing what you know about Iranian society, where do you think the Gorbachevs are going to come from out of the woodwork? Is it going to come from the military? Is it going to come from the young intellectuals? I mean, do you have any, I mean, you're not a prophet, I know, but if you had to sort of give me some indication where this...
I know several Gorbachevs. I know a couple of Gorbachevs among the youth. I know a couple of really, really old Gorbachevs from the National Front movement who kind of hung around and have survived. Because the National Front is the party from which Mossadegh came. Mossadegh being the very popular prime minister who came to power in the early 50s, and who was overthrown, and then the whole crisis that took place, and the coup of 1953 is because of the overthrow of Mossadegh. Well, Mossadegh represented a party, and his party still exists. So there are some old-timers from Mossadegh's time who are, one or two of whom are quite well respected nowadays. Now, I don't know if there would be a single person who can do this, but I think there could potentially be a coalition of all of these characters who can be a serious opposition at some point. I think the most important factor here is for the negotiations to take place, not with Iran, but with the international community, to find a way of putting all the pressure possible on the government of Iran and really delivering a message of solidarity with, when there is a labor strike, with, the bus workers, with the teachers' unions, with, various elements within the Iranian society who seem to be really cut off from the world, because the rest of the world doesn't seem to take any interest in anything but the nuclear issue. But there are, I think in every group or strata of society that you look at, there are one or two really interesting individuals who can potentially be leaders, or at least a coalition of whom can be a serious coalition.
Who is the military loyal to? As you
Who's
know, the
I'm sorry?
military.
in the military? Who
No, I mean, the military is presumably another possible place for
Sure.
the emergence of a Gorbachev.
Yeah.
Who are they loyal to, the president or the Ayatollah?
Well, the military has always been really loyal to a sense of the government, and a government that was dedicated to the nation. And that's in part the reason why the regime initially went about establishing the so-called Revolutionary Guards, because they wanted another group of, armed men who would be exclusively dedicated to them. And so one of the problems today is that we have parallel and competing military or armed entities operating inside Iran. The military could be and has been really, to some degree, loyal to some sense of nationhood and sort of sense of government, and therefore the dirty jobs that they've had to do has gone on with the help of the Revolutionary Guards. In fact, a lot of the overseas operations that they have done, helping the Hezbollah terrorists and everything, has happened through the Revolutionary Guards. So it's really, the Revolutionary Guards is in essence a serious obstacle, has been a serious obstacle to positive movement in Iran. Yes.
How large is the Iranian military? Do Jews serve, and is it compulsory?
No, Jews cannot serve. There are Iranian laws have made it very difficult for religious minorities to 10% of whom are Muslim Sunnis to gain any sort of credible academic, military, or professional advantage in Iran. So Jews cannot serve in the army, and I think the last Iranian Jewish university professor resigned a few years ago, and there are no Jews in the academia anymore. But I wanted to also mention that among the religious minorities in Iran, Muslim Sunnis are also considered a religious minority and suffer pretty much from the same restrictions.
And how large is the military?
I don't want to say, because I can't think of an accurate number. What I think is important about the situation of the military in Iran is that it is not the only armed power in Iran. That the regime very early on built another entity that is dedicated to its own ideology and is extremely brutal, called the Revolutionary Guards, which is a competing entity.
What is the view of Judaism in Islamic Iran? That is, the Islamists in Iran, how do they regard Judaism? Is it different than in other Islamic countries?
I don't want to comment on other countries because I don't know them as well as Iran. In Iran, early on, especially as a result of this meeting I mentioned with Ayatollah Khomeini, Khomeini declared 3 religious minorities as people of the book. The Christians, the Jews, and interestingly enough, the Zoroastrians, who actually aren't people of the book. But because Zoroastrianism was the original religion of Iran, and there are a lot of Zoroastrian festivities and rituals that Iranians still observe, he just didn't want to pick a fight with Zoroastrians, so he just bunched them up together and said they're also people of the book. Because he made that distinction, with it came, certain entitlements. For instance, Jews in Iran have Jewish schools. You know, we have synagogues. We have, you know, several Jewish schools throughout Tehran. But the catch is, the schools can no longer operate with Jewish administrators. So in these fundamentally Jewish schools, the administrators are Muslim. They don't prevent you from teaching Hebrew to the students, but they really strongly discourage you because they don't like to feel that there is a conversation going on in a language that they're not really privy to. So they have no problem with religious studies as long as it's done in Persian, that they can have access to its contents. And the religious material that is being taught, by and large, are texts that either the Department of Education puts out, or are texts that the Department of Education has to approve. And the schools have to be open on Saturdays, which was unheard of in my time. We just had Saturday off, and we were extremely spoiled in that way.
Maybe take one more question.
Sure.
Actually, if we have time.
Sure. So I mean, just to quickly address this, there are, because Jews are considered people of the book, they allowed a certain existence, but this existence is in many ways hampered by the limitations that they put on it.
Roy, you didn't comment about Khomeini's persecution of the Baha'i.
Yes.
Why?
Why didn't I comment?
Right.
Because I was talking about Jews. The Baha'is are in terrible, mortal danger. I think the Baha'i situation could be considered a crime against humanity by people who are the experts in the field and deal with it. I think it's a shame that the world community is not more enlightened and aware of the crimes that have taken place against the Baha'is in Iran, which should not be happening in the 20th and the 21st century.
Thanks.
Take one more, and then we have to
Yeah.
Yes, I didn't take a question from you.
Yeah, I was wondering if you comment a bit about the women's movement. I know that there were shadow reports submitted from Iraqi women's organizations, that some of those women are in prison. There are problems with, I think, the Nobel Prize winner who's been speaking out, and one is, do the Jews outside of Iran unite with the civil human rights movement to deal with people like that within Iran, and also whether or not that movement, with its attention to what is happening to women in Iran, useful or not useful, to Jewish women and other women.
Well, I think actually this goes back to the comment, to the question that Gus had about who are the opposition leaders that you can really point to. Well, that can be sort of tough, but what's really easy to point to is to say, look at an entire category of people, women in this case, who have been the most serious, persistent opposition groups that the regime has ever had in all of its history. And probably the most serious challenge and the most moderating force within the Iranian society have been women. Because, don't take my word for it, just look at the way Iranian women treat the forced or mandatory dress code, which is a scarf, a uniform that's supposed to be baggy and cover up to your knees and pair of pants underneath, closed-toed shoes and everything. Look at every picture that comes out of Iran, on the wires. You have these women who have this tiny kerchief around their heads. They have their bangs kind of coming out this way, and their ponytails coming out the other way. Great makeup, and then they have decided that the length of the Islamic dress code doesn't need to be all the way down to their knees. It can be just barely under their butts. And it doesn't need to be really baggy, it can be extremely narrow and show all the curves that they have. So they have actually deconstructed, to borrow Charles's term, the concept of Islamic dress code, to the point that I think one of these days the mullahs will say, stop doing this and just, go without, for heaven's sake, because this is far worse. Suggestive and just really attention-catching. I think that the women as a gender have served as the most reformist element within the Iranian society, because just by virtue of who they have been and how they have operated, they have managed to be the most serious challenge to the regime. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Attention for just 1 minute. The conversation to continue informally. We're going to have some wine and drinks here. And Roya has agreed to sign some books if anybody's interested. And just to let you know, next week, Professor Milton Shane is coming from the University of Cape Town, which is an interesting case study maybe of Jewish involvement in larger issues. A significant minority of Jews have engaged in the anti-apartheid movement, and so it was interesting dynamic there. So anyway, I want to thank you very much for a very important presentation. And